Hi everyone, my name is Jolie McCrary, and this video is the second part of my Unit 0 Science Practices series. This video is called Psychological Perspectives, and as you might recall from the first video, the concepts in Unit 0 are the foundation for the rest of the course, because what you learn in this unit, you will continue to draw on throughout the course of AP Psychology. This video, you will learn just specifically about the approaches psychologists take when they attempt to explain our mind and our behavior. After the video, you should be able to answer the following questions. What are the main perspectives in psychology, and how do psychological perspectives apply to real world scenarios? And in the bottom right-hand corner, I wanted you to see that the 4 key skills the College Board wants AP Psychology students to utilize throughout the course. Those you can see are concept application, research, methods and design, data interpretation, and argumentation. But the first practice says that students should be able to do concept application. And you can see highlighted there, students should be able to apply psychological perspectives. So, in order to do that, you need to know what the main perspectives in psychology are. So by the end of the video, you should be able to define and apply the following 8 perspectives listed on the screen, and I will go over each one in more depth soon. So first, what do I mean by perspective? A perspective is simply a point of view. Not all psychologists think alike, and the way that they think about psychological concepts is influenced by their perspective. Depending on their perspective, a psychologist might explain the root cause of a behavior differently than another psychologist from a different perspective. And it's not that one perspective is more right or more wrong. These are just viewpoints that help inform a psychologist's approach to what they study. You can think of a perspective like a framework or a lens, a pair of glasses that a psychologist uses to see and explain why people act and think the way they do. And each perspective focuses on different ideas and ways of studying how our minds work. Perspectives can also be referred to as approaches to psychology or even viewpoints in psychology. So, the first perspective is the evolutionary perspective. Psychologists who take an evolutionary approach are going to use the knowledge and principles from evolutionary biology and apply them to the structure of the human mind. Evolutionary psychologists consider and examine how aspects like natural selection and survival mechanisms might determine our thought processes and our behaviors in an attempt to keep our species going from one generation to the next. Some psychologists take a biological approach to explaining the mind and human behavior. The biological perspective seeks to understand and explain how the elements of our brain and our bodies are connected to our behaviors and our thought processes. They are going to be concerned with things like the nervous system, neurotransmitters, hormones, and genes, and how those factors affect the way we think and how we act. Some psychologists take a psychodynamic approach to explaining the mind and behavior. These psychologists are influenced by the work of Sigmund Freud, who developed a field called psychoanalysis. This viewpoint focuses on the unconscious mind. So they're going to focus on things like repressed memories or inner motivations and conflicts you aren't aware of, and how those unconscious aspects are influencing your thoughts and actions. The behaviorist approach is going to look at behaviors. This field was developed by John B. Watson, who was inspired by the work of Ivan Pavlov in classical conditioning. And the behavioral perspective is going to focus on psychology as an objective science, something that you can see and observe. Hence, behaviorism or behavioral, because unlike our thoughts, you can see and observe your behaviors. Behavioral psychologists look at how the environment, things like rewards and punishments, shape our behaviors, as well as how pairing different stimuli can produce different actions. Some psychologists take a humanistic approach to explaining the human mind and behavior. This field was made popular by people like Abraham Maslow and Carl Rogers. Humanistic psychologists focus on the human capacity for healthy personal choice and potential and growth. They're going to see the inherent goodness in people, and they will believe that our behaviors and our thoughts can be influenced by our own free will to determine a better future. This is really different from some of the previous perspectives. Think about the evolutionary psychologist who is going to explain our behaviors as a consequence of adaptations for survival, or the biological psychologist who is going to think about our behaviors as influenced by our brain chemistry. A humanistic psychologist is going to believe that we have the power to make those changes in our own lives, that we have the power and potential for growth and self-actualization. The next perspective is the cognitive perspective. And the cognitive perspective focuses primarily on mental processes rather than behaviors. So things like problem solving, thinking, memory, perception, creativity. When explaining psychological phenomena, psychologists from this perspective will likely look at the mind and our thoughts, and they will describe how we're acting through our thought processes. Some of the most influential cognitive psychologists are Jean Piaget, Lev Vygotsky, and Albert Bandura. Some psychologists take a social cultural approach to explaining the mind and human behavior. The social cultural perspective focuses on how human behaviors and mental processes are influenced by our interactions with others, their social environments, and the norms and expectations of our communities and cultures. And finally, some psychologists take a biopsychosocial approach to explaining the mind and human behavior. This approach examines how multiple interconnected factors influence our thoughts and our behaviors. So, those factors are biological factors, things like our neurochemistry, and our social factors, like our peer groups, as well as our psychological factors, like our self esteem, and how those work together to influence the way we think and the way we act. So, those are the 8 perspectives of psychology. And as you can probably recall from the beginning of the video, not only do you need to be able to explain those perspectives, but you need to be able to apply them to real world scenarios. So, in the next part of the video, I will share with you a few examples of psychologists coming from different perspectives. And I would like for you to think about what perspective they are taking. So to close out the video, I have 4 questions for review. I will only read the questions, but the answers, you will need to take some time to pause the video, read them, and determine which one is correct. I'll share the correct answers with you at the end of the video. So this question says, psychologist number 1 is seeing a patient about a behavior they wish to correct. The patient is frequently lying as a strategy to gain social advantages, secure resources, or avoid conflicts. This psychologist believes that lying might be derived as a mechanism of survival, which helped previous generations succeed and thrive. What perspective is this psychologist coming from? The next question says, psychologist number 2 is seeing a patient about a behavior they wish to correct. The patient is frequently skin picking as a response to stress, anxiety, or other triggers. This psychologist believes the behavior results from a combination of factors, such as genetic predisposition for impulsivity, a stressful work environment, and possibly individual psychological coping mechanisms. What perspective is this psychologist coming from? The next question states, psychologist number 3 is seeing a patient about a phobia that severely impacts their daily life. This psychologist believes the phobia stems from unresolved, unconscious conflicts and repressed memories from early childhood experiences. What perspective is this psychologist taking? And the last question states, psychologist number 4 is seeing a patient experiencing severe depression that affects their daily functioning. This psychologist believes the depression is due to imbalances in brain chemistry, possibly due to low levels of serotonin. What perspective is this psychologist taking? So, this concludes part 2, psychological perspectives. If you would like to check the answers to the multiple choice review questions, you can find those at the bottom of the screen. If you want to check your understanding, see if you can explain the main perspectives in psychology, and if you can describe how psychological perspectives apply to real world situations. You should also be able to define the 8 perspectives in psychology.